Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the very first extended program for the MIT Sloan CIO Symposium. I'm glad that all of you could make it. So we have a treat for you today. Linda Rabieh is going to be our keynote speaker. She is a senior lecturer at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She's taught political philosophy there since 2010, primarily in the Concourse program, which you're going to hear more about. And that is an interdisciplinary program in the humanities and sciences, but also in political science and philosophy departments. She received her PhD in political philosophy from the University of Toronto. She is the author of Plato and the Virtue of Courage, which was published in 2006, which won the Delba Winthrop Mansfield Prize for Excellence in Political Science. And she was the recipient of the National Endowment of Humanities Independent Scholar Fellowship. And for the past 9 years, Linda has been co-director of an annual January study program for MIT students to Greece and Rome. And more recently, she became one of the faculty directors of the Civil Discourse Project at MIT, something that might have inspired some of today's activities. She writes and teaches courses on ancient and medieval treatments of ethics in war, political ambition, and the extent and limits of knowledge. Please join me in welcoming Linda Rabieh.
Thank you very much. This is on. Excellent. Thank you very much, Alan, for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. About that intro, as someone whose research and teaching focuses on classical political philosophy, I am hardly the obvious person to speak to you about technical and information innovations of the 21st century. Indeed, innovation was in general treated with more than a little suspicion by classical philosophers. On the other hand, perhaps the most famous philosopher, classical and otherwise, Socrates, was about as much of an innovator as it's possible to be. He so completely changed the way we think about philosophy that every philosopher who preceded him came to be known as pre-Socratic. This is because Socrates was the first, as Cicero says, to bring philosophy down from the heavens and compel it to inquire into moral and political questions. In other words, Socrates founded something like what I'm going to call liberal education. And I'd like to make the case to you today that making Socrates' innovation, i.e. liberal education, available to our students is the best way to prepare them to assume positions of leadership and to address many of the challenges of our time. So to do this, I'm going to sketch first what I mean by liberal education, that thing we do in Concourse at MIT. Next, I will discuss why it is in trouble today. And finally, I'm going to argue that the problems confronting liberal education should be your concern. Why? Because the same problems that threaten liberal education also threaten the sound judgment and humane outlook essential to address existing and future technological changes wisely. Okay, so what is liberal education? I'm going to begin by explaining what I mean by that phrase, because I think it's not obvious. I've been teaching at MIT for coming up on 14 years, and I will say liberal education is a little bit of a hard sell here. People usually come to MIT because they know what they want to be and do. Solve climate change, develop new biotechnology, make smarter computers. And the amazing possibilities of technology are so enticing that they want to rush headlong into these challenges. But this means that they tend to see courses like mine where we sit around a table and discuss old books. It's so old school, I don't even use PowerPoint or slides. They think of it as at best something that might give them some cocktail party cred, and at worst as a dusty curricular requirement that has somehow eluded reform. Now, why do they feel this way? Well, because people like me are asking them, before rushing off to do all these things, to slow down and think about them, to reflect more on how new technologies help people and what even is the most important kind of help. Food, shelter, material goods are all necessary for happiness, but are they sufficient? What else is needed for human happiness? And wouldn't it be important to know that in order to help in the most important way? So liberal education is about asking these kinds of questions. It doesn't provide a technical or other skill, or even a way to earn a living. Well, sometimes it does. Rather, it seeks to understand human nature so that one can act well in any skill or profession. Liberal education focuses on the ends and goals of human life, what is essential for human flourishing and why. And this seems to me to be the distinctive knowledge needed by a leader in any field. And let me spell this out a little bit more. Liberal education means literally an education in freedom. But it's a particular kind of freedom. It's freedom of the mind. What is freedom of the mind, you might be wondering? Or perhaps you're thinking, wait a second, of course we have freedom of the mind. That's what it means to live in liberal democracies. But not at least according to Socrates' famous image of the cave, which, if you haven't read Plato's Republic, you might know from a sci-fi version of it in the movie The Matrix. In The Matrix, the mysterious figure Morpheus tells the young man named Neo that the world he thinks he's living in isn't the true world. But to learn about that true world will be neither easy nor pleasant. Neo will need courage to take that famous red pill that will lead him to enlightenment. Now, in the original image of the cave, Socrates says that before we're educated, our minds are like someone who's born into a cave and prevented from looking anywhere but towards the back wall of that cave, where he mistakes the shadows he sees projected there for real things. Now, continuing the analogy, Socrates describes education as the process of releasing oneself from the bonds that keep us fixated on those shadows so that we can clearly examine their source. And liberal education is the mechanism that for us loosens those bonds. It does so by facilitating our confrontation with various answers to the enduring questions of human existence, especially those answers that differ from or challenge our own. Through grappling with these arguments, we free our hearts and minds from what society pressures us to accept without adequate argument. Now, liberal education doesn't demand that we ultimately reject those views, only that we become aware of their complexity and of the need to ground or argue for them. Okay, so what are these questions that constitute the substance of a liberal education? Questions that I've called the enduring questions of human existence. Now, I hope some of you in here remember George Carlin's 7 words that you can't say on TV. Well, these are the 5 what is questions that we're not supposed to discuss in polite company, but which liberal education says we must. What is justice? What is virtue or good character? What is friendship? What is love? And what is death? Now, why these questions? Because they all strike at the heart of our human experience. They're the things we care about, the things we fight about, and to which we need answers if we're going to live well as individuals and in communities. So in what sense are all of these questions for us? In particular, sort of taboo or difficult questions for us. Let me give you a few examples for each topic, beginning with justice. We seem to know what justice is. We certainly confidently label various actions and people just and unjust all the time, and we do so from a very young age, right? From the very first time we say, that's not fair. But is it really so clear what is fair? We speak of justice as the common good, or what's fair in the sense of being good for all equally, but we also speak of it in terms of what specific people deserve. So what happens when the two conflict? Consider the episode depicted in another movie, The Imitation Game, when Churchill evidently allowed the destruction of a convoy of ships to avoid revealing that the British had cracked the German code, intelligence which would ultimately help them win the war. So when these conflict, which justice should take precedence, and how do we decide? We think of justice, or putting others' good ahead of our own, as the core of good character. Think of George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life. But is that the only, or even the most important aspect of good character? Is good character something that's merely instrumental to help us get the other good things? Or is good character somehow good for its own sake? How important is love to a life of human flourishing? Do human beings even have the capacity for genuinely unselfish devotion to one another? What is friendship? Are colleagues and fellow citizens friends? If so, how do these friendships differ in terms of what we owe to our other personal friends? And finally, death. How does mortality shape us? Is mortality something we should try to overcome, or must it be understood and reconciled with as something essentially human? So liberal education is the rigorous examination of these questions through a careful study of an array of great books that address them and offer various attempts to answer them. Now let me pause for a moment on the question of what counts as a great book, because this is surely contested today. But I'd argue that it's actually not as difficult to determine as we might think. Great books can come from anywhere because their origin is less important than their approach. Great books are deeply learned and influential efforts to raise and try to come to grips with questions about what constitutes a life worth living. So here are a few questions one could ask with a view to determining what counts as a great book. Does it show an awareness that these are difficult, contested questions? Does the author wrestle with a variety of answers and arguments? And here again, I will cite Socrates, who in dialogues that take place in the last weeks of his life is even then conjuring up the arguments of a great rival of his, the famous and long since dead sophist or relativist of his day, Protagoras, to challenge himself and the young people around him. And it's in precisely this way that Socrates provides a model of how to engage with these arguments rigorously. I'm going to call it a particular version of that overused phrase, critical thinking. Liberal education requires critical thinking. But critical thinking can't begin by being critical of the author or even the author's argument. Critical thinking must begin first by grasping an argument in all of its force, and even why that argument might be superior to one's own position. Only then can you begin to assess what's compelling about it, or not, what's not compelling about it. And this means that critical thinking requires reading carefully, being constantly engaged with the text, putting pieces of an argument together, noticing what's missing, considering what the missing alternative might be, and why that alternative might not have been explored. It's hard work. since the greatest authors think that seeing something for oneself is the best way to understand it, and thus they write in a way that doesn't hand you an argument on a plate, but demands that you struggle for it. But this kind of thinking is also profoundly rewarding. Only by engaging with texts in this way do we enter into the great debates that have persisted throughout history and which transcend our ethnicities, nationalities, religions, and sexes. Above all, we get to learn not simply about these thinkers or their books, but from them. Okay, now in light of what I've just argued is the core of liberal education, perhaps you already understand why it might be in trouble today. Liberal education involves exploring many arguments which we may find objectionable. Moreover, if we're going to take seriously and debate the adequacy of those arguments, we have to first try to understand and even make the case for those objectionable answers. In short, liberal education requires intense, vigorous, sometimes heated, and certainly fearless debate about all those topics that people avoid today precisely because they're hotly contested. So the irony of George Carlin, for those of you who knew George Carlin, right, swear words we can and do all say all the time. It's now opinions that are really taboo. And I'd like to highlight 3 recent trends that are especially troubling because they undermine the spirit and practice of liberal education. First, and this is something many people have noted, students today are especially sensitive. And it's a sensitivity compounded by the reigning dogma that merely hearing objectionable speech causes harm. And it's thus no surprise that even perceived slights justify anger and blame and bring a quick end to open, civil, and reasoned debate on difficult questions. Second is another powerful opinion today, and that's that human relations can be best understood as power relations, and that the only uncontroversial moral principle is that the powerful are oppressors. Well, it would be foolish to deny that human beings seek and abuse power, and no thinker that I've encountered does so. There is a difference between saying the desire to exert power is one human motivation and saying that it is the only or even the most fundamental one. The most obvious difficulty with this view is that those who argue for overthrowing the powerful and taking their place don't consider themselves to be motivated only by power, but rather by justice or a moral principle, which they intend to implement. Now, this is not, of course, to suggest that those in power are simply motivated by justice or moral principle either, but only that since everyone claims to speak in terms of justice, it's that claim about justice that needs to be examined first in order to determine what should or shouldn't be defended or opposed. And the failure to see this, the failure to see justice as the sort of crucial claim that everyone at least makes, fosters unthinking moral outrage and a simplistic understanding of complex problems. Finally, and somewhat in tension with the prior point, is also the view that motivated by an impulse that's rooted in tolerance, but especially deadly to liberal education, is that we can't say anything true about moral opinions. And this view explains why many smart MIT students shy away from engaging in tough conversations about difficult issues. They, and not only they, take for granted that the most important moral and political issues of the day are insoluble. As a result, students and the professionals or leaders they will become are ever more inclined simply to wipe their hands of these questions altogether. I'm sure you can all agree that that is not a good policy for any of us. All right, so why should you care about all of these developments? Well, I'm not exaggerating when I say that these are crippling beliefs. They reduce liberal education to something that's either harmful or useless. Now, my concern about this development is maybe obvious, but I think you need to be equally concerned, because these views, these tendencies oppose not only liberal education, they oppose tough-minded, clear, and nuanced thinking about complex problems, precisely the kind of problems leaders must address. Liberal education is thus the education most needed by our future leaders, who must confront myriad ethical questions regarding the use of AI, not to say those in energy, medicine, and countless other arenas. In short, our students need liberal education, and we need them to get a liberal education. Because the practice of liberal education itself will cultivate the requisite character traits. So let me talk a little bit now about what are these character traits cultivated by liberal education. So first, momentarily, back to the Matrix. Recall the main character, Neo, is presented with that choice of taking the red pill, which will allow him to know the truth. The choice is a momentous one, precisely because the experience of examining what's familiar, of seeing it's not what we thought it was or is daunting and can be painful. And this is no less true for our students. It takes courage to engage in liberal education. And this means that to help students benefit from it, we have to stop treating the university classroom as an armchair, i.e. a place we go to be comfortable. We shouldn't protect students from facing difficult questions. They must be willing to try out new arguments and consider things they haven't before. Now that said, vigorous and open discussion cannot happen in a vacuum. In addition to courage, students must develop the other intellectual and moral habits. They must listen to others and give them the benefit of the doubt. Most importantly, and I think hardest, they must learn that the core of liberal education is to be critical of one's own opinions. It's all too easy, we all know, to criticize others and see their flaws. The most challenging thing we can do is subject our own opinions to the most exacting scrutiny. Second, liberal education means reading a range of texts. But the difference should be determined not on the basis of the author's sex, religion, ethnicity, but on the basis of the author's arguments. Encountering a range of different arguments allows students to see that the analysis of human nature and human motivation is far more complex than merely the opposition of powerful and powerless. They see that the tension between a concern for justice and a concern for one's own emerges in all serious considerations of justice. They learn how different thinkers address this tension in a variety of ways, both in terms of individual happiness and political life. And they're thus led to reflect on this tension in themselves and in their communities. And through doing this, they're better prepared, I think, to grasp the complexity of justice. And third, liberal education is not all about questions. It would be a fair criticism if all it did were to take young people and leave them thinking there are no good answers to any serious moral or political issue. But this is the result, I would say, not of liberal education, but of its repudiation. Well, of course, it would go too far to say that liberal education provides all the answers. It does help students see that it is possible to make better and worse answers to life's thorniest problems. By engaging themselves in these great debates among thinkers of the highest rank, they learn how to deliberate well about fundamental questions, even if absolute certainty eludes us. They discover a thinking that allows for serious and even passionate debate, but without anger and partisan rancor. In my experience, students exposed to this, at first perhaps gingerly, but soon enthusiastically, embrace this outlook. Okay, so how does all of this apply to leadership? Well, I'm no expert in leadership, at least not in the manner of people who teach in business schools, but based on my study and teaching about some extraordinary leaders in history, I'd like to suggest that there are at least 4 character traits that are necessary for good leadership, which are fostered by liberal education. As I've indicated, open, rigorous, and difficult examination of foundational moral and political questions with a view to understanding human nature, its needs, its excellences, its weaknesses, requires very specific character traits. These traits can be directly applied to the demands of leadership. First and foremost, intellectual and moral courage, which I would describe as the ability to acknowledge, confront, and follow through on tough decisions. One of the gravest weaknesses in a leader is the unwillingness or even the hesitation to face such decisions and the inevitable criticism that arises from having to make them. It's all too tempting to delay them in the hope of avoiding censure, only to make them harder to implement in the long run. To be willing to assume the responsibility of making difficult decisions requires the courage to rely on the soundness of your own final judgment. But for this to be a reasonable courage demands some experience in and a solid basis for thinking through important considerations. A courageous leader doesn't shy away from such decisions, but in fact embraces them as part of what it means to be a leader. So that's courage. Second, prudence or good judgment. Understanding the problem of the common good, the necessary trade-offs in human life, as well as the most important ends of human life, gives one the foundation on which to rest one's decisions, especially when they have significant social consequences. To ensure that the impact they are making in the world is truly for the better and not the worse, leaders must have a capacious judgment that encompasses a thoughtful vision of the future and how their innovations promote the human good. Third is a spirit of gentle humanity or compassion. An understanding of human nature inspires the recognition that most human beings are a complex mix of wanting to be good and wanting the good for themselves. It thus tempers harshness with an awareness of human frailty. And the awareness of our common humanity also nurtures a sense of responsibility for one's fellow human beings. It promotes a wish to understand and to try either to avoid or at least to mitigate the harmful consequences that great innovations will inevitably have on many of our fellow citizens and human beings. It also teaches what motivates and inspires human beings and the critical need to encourage excellence and reward merit. Finally, and fourth, is moderation or self-restraint, which at least in its classical sense means most importantly intellectual humility. It's an awareness of what you don't know or of the limits of knowledge. Socrates' famous human wisdom is not that he knows nothing, but that he doesn't think he knows what he doesn't know. This, I would say, is the hallmark of genuine open-mindedness, and it allows one to be sufficiently skeptical of one's own inclinations so as to insist on acquiring as much input and critical feedback as possible, while still in the end being confident enough to rely on one's best judgment after digesting the relevant information. So the upshot: a leader obviously needs some knowledge about one's particular field, but the questions facing leaders usually have less to do with technical details than with their larger impact. It's to make these decisions that a mind well-formed by liberal education is crucial. Finally, let me conclude by saying something about one particular new technology that we face today. Many MIT students, and they're hardly alone in this, have embraced the efficiency supplied by large language models like ChatGPT. They argue that it's writing's version of the calculator, freeing us from unnecessary chores so that we can devote ourselves to, I hear this phrase a lot, higher level thinking. And my first question when I hear them say this is, what exactly do people have in mind by this higher level thinking? If it's how to develop or discover better tools for human beings to live well, then we're kind of back to that question of what it is we're actually doing when we are living well, and not simply acquiring the things in order to live well. In other words, I think we're a little confused about what higher level thinking actually is. It's not just instrumental thinking, how we make more things that will help us live well, but consists in doing the thing, i.e. living, itself. And what does this mean? It means engaging with the good things around us by thinking about and understanding them and why they are good. And therein, I think, lies the problem with these LLMs. They threaten to replace the thinking that is the essence of human flourishing or living well. In other words, surveying vast amounts of information instantaneously is not thinking. At least it's not the distinctively human activity of thinking. Human thinking is not grasping information, but understanding what is important to and for human beings. Take the example of coming up with a paper topic on a difficult text, something I'm familiar with, or writing a condolence letter. Why not assign either of those to ChatGPT? And I would say struggling to discover the crucial question in a text, or thinking about the importance of death and loss and how to comfort someone appropriately about it, that is human thinking. And abdicating this to an LLM is to abdicate the core of what it means to be human. Moreover, thinking about such questions not only is part of human flourishing, but it also helps us innovate in a way that's compatible with human flourishing and especially with good character. We must be equally vigilant about promoting the activity that nurtures those character traits for responsible, effective citizenship. The possibility of a free republic, as many philosophers have made clear, stands or falls according to the character of its citizens. The idea of freedom has long inspired and elevated human beings. But devoid of discipline, self-control, and understanding, freedom can lead just as easily, as Aristotle famously said, could lead us just as easily to be the worst among the animals. Leadership, but particularly leadership in a free society, requires and depends upon character, or to use a very old-fashioned word, virtue. And liberal education is still the best source we have for fostering it. Thank you very much.